is nothing more essential to a human being than having control of our own bodies. It is currently illegal for women to terminate their pregnancies in any circumstance in 24 countries, with a further 37 restricting access in any case except when the mother's life is in danger. In 1973, Roe v. Wade was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court is poised to strike down the landmark 1973 ruling, and millions of American women face losing their access to legal abortions, joining millions more living in those countries rejecting a woman's right to choose. As the Supreme Court moves to end abortion rights, is America still a free country? Trigger warning to listeners. This episode deals with stories around abortion and racism that could be distressing to some listeners. This is Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I am Smita Tharoor. Hello. I'd like to introduce Lynn Paltrow. Lynn is an attorney and the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women, a non-profit advocacy organization. NAPW, as it's called, works to ensure that no one is denied civil or human rights because of pregnancy or any outcome of pregnancy, including birth, miscarriage, stillbirth, or abortion. Lynn and I happened to bump into each other in New York a few weeks ago, and we got talking, and I got so excited about the work that Lynn is doing, the amazing work that Lynn is doing to support these pregnant women, that I felt that we would love to hear her voice. We would love to hear Lynn's stories on the work that she has done and the lessons that she would have learned around unconscious bias. So I'm very grateful, Lynn, for you having joining us for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was really lovely meeting you.
So unconscious bias, Lynn, what do you understand by that?
It's a term that clearly has some very specific meaning, and I do not think of myself as an expert in unconscious bias, but I have been thinking a lot about it. It comes up for me as the notion of presumptions, biases that might be favorable or unfavorable that one is not aware of, that one is not conscious of. But as I tried to think about this question, I also realized that it's very hard for me to tease apart in many of the cases that I work on, what is unconscious bias and what is actually just flat out prejudice, presumption, and discrimination. That's not really unconscious at all. I think often both things are operating at the same time in the kinds of very intersectional cases that I work on.
That's really interesting because, of course, it's a presumption, it's an assumption, and yes, we're just human beings and we all jump to conclusions. But then you're saying something else in addition to that. You're saying there is some conscious bias that comes in as well. And there is an intersectionality because of the work that you do. Tell us more, Lynn. How does that look?
For example, one of the cases that I worked on for many years involved a hospital in South Carolina where a white nurse decided she was seeing a problem of cocaine use among her Black pregnant patients. The Medical University of South Carolina has a patient base of approximately 70% of their patient base is Black. And having heard about somebody being arrested in the upstate of South Carolina, she went to the hospital's lawyer and said, gosh, why can't we have these women arrested too? And general counsel for the hospital didn't say, hey, wait a minute, we're a healthcare provider. We should be talking about the health issues here and what we can do about them. He said, what a great idea, and called a meeting with the local police and prosecutor's office, whereby they established a policy through which they would do drug testing of their Black patients, their Black pregnant patients, and use those drug tests as a search for evidence of criminality and turn that information over to the police and have women taken out of the hospital, some still pregnant, some having just given birth and still bleeding, having them taken out in chains and shackles and arrested for a number of possible crimes, including drug delivery, presumably through their umbilical cords, and criminal child endangerment. When the policy was put into place, the only patients who were tested and for whom this policy was applied at a point where it didn't even pretend to be a policy about trying to persuade them or put pressure on them to get treatment, which, by the way, there was none of. There was no treatment for pregnant women with cocaine problems in Charleston, South Carolina at the time they put this policy into place. And when they put it into place, it was targeted only at Black patients. And people in the hospital brought that to their attention. It was not unconscious that the only patients that they were secretly searching and turning over to the police were Black. It was obvious from the color of the skin of their patients. It was obvious from the fact that the policy that they invented was not used at any of the private clinics associated with the hospital. It was only their Black patients. It's hard for me to believe it was unconscious bias.
Kind of lost for words, Lynn, because that I'm trying to visualize those pregnant or just been a mother patient who's just being taken away in chain and shackles for something that they might have done. And the fact that you believe that this was a conscious bias rather than an unconscious kind of, to me, makes sense too, because it was not an instinct. It was not a sudden jumping to conclusion. A presumption is the word you used earlier on. So before we go further with stories like this, can we go back a little bit, Lynn? You're the founder of the National Advocate for Pregnant Women. What brought you into this arena? I mean, do you have a story there that perhaps challenged your unconscious bias to make you want to even become a founder of this?
That's a great question. I started out as a lawyer defending the right to choose abortion and worked at organizations that were challenging laws restricting abortion in the United States. And then somehow I started getting cases in which the same arguments that were being used to justify attempts to limit abortion, recriminalize it in the United States, were also being used against women who didn't want to end their pregnancies, who weren't seeking to have abortions. One of those cases was the Angela Carter case, in which a very critically ill woman was forced to have cesarean surgery, even though the judge knew that the surgery itself could kill her. The argument was that she was pregnant, presumptively very far along in her pregnancy. She was at 25 or 26 weeks. There was a neonatologist claiming that all fetuses at that stage of development were viable, and that the fetus had a right to life. And therefore, even though Angela was very much alive and did not consent to the surgery, was begging for treatment to address the recurrence of cancer she was experiencing, the judge ordered the cesarean knowing it could kill her. They carried out the cesarean. She died. The fetus was born alive and died within several hours, and Angela Carter died 2 days later with the cesarean surgery listed as a contributing factor. And part of the argument for that forced cesarean that resulted in her death and did not result in the survival of her baby was an analogy to abortion. She couldn't have an abortion at 25 weeks of pregnancy, so why could she be allowed to make decisions about her own life and her own body and refuse cesarean surgery, which is quite extraordinary since no one in the United States is allowed to be forced to undergo surgery for the benefit of anyone else, any other living person, including a twin or a child or somebody they originally agreed to donate something to and then changed their mind. I also started getting calls about cases in which women were being arrested in relationship to their pregnancies. The first case was a low-income white woman, Pamela Ray Stewart, who gave birth, was bleeding profusely, hemorrhaging at the time of getting to the hospital. The baby was born alive and died. And then she was prosecuted in California for a failure to support her essentially unborn child and arrested. You know, that was so interesting. The prosecutor cited a number of things that he claimed was caused the hemorrhaging, the fetal death. And there was a reference to use of drugs, although it later became very clear there was no evidence she had used any drugs. But the charges also included not getting to the hospital quickly enough on the day of delivery and having intercourse with her husband. And the intercourse with her husband on the day of the morning of the delivery not only was likely non consensual, because an expose later revealed that her husband brutally beat her, was often reported to the police for serious abuse of her. But it was described as her crime was described as having subjected herself to the rigors of sexual intercourse, as if no one else was involved in it. I have to say, in both cases, we had positive outcomes. Angela Carter was dead, but the court said that just because she was perceived to be near the end of her life and pregnant, and later in pregnancy, she did not lose her right to medical decision making. And the court did dismiss the charge against Pamela Ray Stewart. And then most of the other cases I started to get in those years, the very late 80s, early 90s, targeted particularly Black pregnant women, Black mothers, who were accused of using the smokable form of cocaine crack. And it was very much part of the very racist, deliberately misinforming crack baby myth and period in the United States that was used to justify extraordinary control over and penalties of particularly Black people in the United
So
States.
there are two things going on here, Lynn. Also, for the record, I should say that you are not Black, you are white. And it's because of the fact that you're an attorney and you have seen the kind of things that have been happening while you are working way back in the 80s and 90s. That moved you enough for you to start this organization to continue to support pregnant women. It was for all pregnant women. But what you've been seeing is specifically, and we go back to the word bias, conscious, racist, discriminatory bias towards Black women. But the headline about this is not just about the color of their skin, but it's also the reason people are being discriminatory, and correct me if I'm wrong, is also because they want to be caught out for drugs and dealing of drugs. So it's a combination of the two. And statistically, and again, I do not know enough of these statistics, are there more white people rather than Black who are actually caught for drugs or who deal with drugs? I don't know. But yet Black people are caught and charged for far more. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, there are far too many people who are arrested for many, many crimes in the United States. We deal with so many things through the criminal law system rather than having a meaningful system of universal health care, public health infrastructure. Many things are addressed through the criminal law system, and extraordinarily disproportionately so against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. But I know you were trying to get me to talk more personally, so I will just reflect back. I am a white, Jewish, cisgender woman. I'm a lesbian. I had long been a feminist. And when I was in law school and I read Roe v. Wade for the first time, I didn't read it just as a decision about the right to choose abortion. And that's the 1973 US
Yes.
Court decision finding that there is a fundamental right to abortion, declaring criminal abortion laws unconstitutional. And I read it, though, as also the first decision, and really it was the first decision in 1973 in which the Supreme Court was acknowledging the constitutional personhood of women and the people who get pregnant. It wasn't until, for the very first time, it was only in 1972, that there was a single Supreme Court decision in the United States saying that discrimination on the basis of sex violated our Constitution's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. And in 1973, you get the first time in which the court says fetuses at no stage of development are persons, and in effect recognize that the people who get pregnant are full constitutional persons through all stages of pregnancy.
Which is huge. I
Huge.
mean, yeah. And 1973, I mean, that's so many years ago.
Yes and no. I mean, it took, hundreds of years to get a first Supreme Court decision that prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, which, did not happen until 1972 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a case that finally got there. But it was also an interesting decision because there was a woman whose pseudonym was Jane Roe. Her name was really Norma McCorvey. She got pregnant in Texas. The Texas law prohibited abortion, as it is essentially once again doing today. But she brought her case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of the United States has what are called very strict rules for access to that court. You have to be directly, personally harmed by the law you challenge. Otherwise, there would be millions of cases. So you can't even get reviewed by the court unless you have what's called standing, a personal connection to the case. There was a married couple, a married white heterosexual couple called John and Mary Doe, who also wanted to challenge the Texas law. And their argument was not that the Mary was pregnant and needed an abortion at that time, but she had a number of health conditions that if she became pregnant, it could be very dangerous. They couldn't be sure that contraception would prevent pregnancy. It's not 100% effective. And they needed to know that abortion would be available to her to ensure what they politely called their marital happiness. So their heterosexual relationship. And the court said that Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe, had standing. She had a direct impact. She was pregnant. She could bring the case, even though she might not be pregnant when the case finally got to them. But they threw out John and Mary Doe saying that the harm to them is purely hypothetical, that they might get pregnant, that the contraception might fail, that she might get pregnant, that there might be a health problem. That's just too remote a harm to give you the right, the access to the court to challenge this law. And I read it as someone who was just figuring out that I was gay, and I was thinking, oh my God, the court hasn't even accepted heterosexuality. I shouldn't feel so badly that they haven't yet recognized the right to be gay. And, I was off to the races with that decision, which for me stood for the fundamental feminist argument that the people who have the capacity for pregnancy should be recognized and treated as full constitutional persons.
So it was that moment, really, because I think it came together, firstly becoming confident in your own sexuality at the same time as this going on in the country where you're living in terms of laws and control over man and women, heterosexual couples, as much as women, and also that you're feminist. So there were a few things going on there. And you are where you are now, Lynn, so many years later, running this NGO. Perhaps you could share a story with us that genuinely surprised you, because you now have so many years of experience. You started off as a lawyer and you've got to where you are now, and you still do, support and advocacy of pregnant women under very many different conditions. Has there been a story perhaps where, even despite your enormous experience, you were surprised when something happened?
There are many of those cases. And I want to talk about one case that I do think is where I really started to think about the places where my cases involved unconscious bias. And one example, and it will also help me to answer your question earlier about drugs, but one case that I worked on, the Bebe Shui case. Bebe Shui was in the United States, Chinese immigrant who is here completely legally, working hard in Indiana. She got pregnant, and in about the 30th week or so of her pregnancy, the father of the baby she wanted very much told her he was abandoning her. He was going to go back to his wife, and that she was on her own, and left her sobbing on her knees in a parking lot. In extreme distress and humiliation, she responded by attempting suicide. She took rat poison. Somehow friends found her before she died. They got her to a hospital. She underwent various treatments and survived, and also did everything they asked to ensure that her baby would survive. She underwent cesarean surgery, and the baby was born alive, but then did not survive. And she was arrested for the crimes of feticide and attempted fetal murder, and was held in jail for over a year. In Indiana, being charged with murder is not a bailable offense. You don't get to wait to your trial outside of jail. But her case helped me to understand that there is a huge role of unconscious bias in the work that I do that I think has hardly been explored. And what I mean by that, I was flying to Indiana to do work on the case, to help organize a rally in her support. And a gentleman I was sitting next to on the plane asked why I was flying to Indiana. And I told him the story of the case and how Bebe Shui and her just incredible distress attempted suicide, and explained that she was then arrested for attempting suicide while pregnant. I should explain that in the United States, there's not a single state that makes it a crime to attempt suicide. But because she was pregnant, they arrested her and treated her as if she were attempting murder. And the guy sitting next to me turned to me and said, "Well, why didn't she just wait until she wasn't pregnant anymore?" And a huge light bulb went off in my head. It was sort of like realizing that so many people seem to have this belief about pregnant women that they sort of have superpowers, that somehow because she was pregnant, she should have been able to control her suicidal ideation, her extreme depression, have control over her self loathing or whatever it was, somehow because she was pregnant. And it was realizing in that moment that people do have a set of beliefs about the power pregnant women have, or their unique power they should have, that simply doesn't match how people
I'm,
actually work.
I'm just shaking my head in disbelief. I mean, I am a mother. I have been pregnant, in fact, 3 times. And I, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that story other than appreciate that there are clearly so many people who, certainly when we think of pregnant women, I do know, being pregnant, that we often seem to actually be everybody's property. When you're out there, strangers will want to put their hand on your stomach and say, stranger as in somebody you might have met socially for the first time, and say, "Oh, is that sweet? Do you think I could feel the baby kicking or something?" Or we'll ask you questions or we'll advise you on how to live your life. So there's some strange ownership on your body when
Yeah,
you are pregnant, which I find in itself an unconscious bias. But then there's also, which you've now added to, which I hadn't really thought about. And so thank you so much, is this expectation that when you're pregnant, you really are in control of everything that you're doing. And that poor woman, my God, I can't even imagine what she must have been going through. And to suggest that she was able to be in control of her own life and not attempt suicide until she was no longer pregnant, yes, that must have taken you aback to hear that.
it was just very clarifying in a way that rather than having any kind of sympathy for her, what she had been through at any level, being abandoned, attempting suicide, she absolutely wanted to have that baby and was devastated by the fact that it didn't survive. And absolutely no sympathy for her at all, only the belief that she should have somehow had superhuman powers to time her suicide until after she had given birth. But I have some other examples, I think,
Please.
of
Mm.
unconscious bias. And these overlap in some ways, but most of the cases that we deal with in which there are arrests involve women who've given birth to perfectly healthy babies. But there's an enormous amount of misinformation, and particularly about pregnancy and criminalized drugs in the United States, so that people readily believe that if a pregnant woman takes any amount of any controlled substance, including marijuana, she is risking harm to her future child and should be punished. There's a lot to unpack there, but getting to another piece of this, however, is many of the cases I've worked on, even though the majority of them involve women who have perfectly healthy babies, a number of the cases that we work on involve arrests of women, Rennie Gibbs, Chelsea Becker, Adora Perez, Brittany Pula, who have had miscarriages or stillbirths that were blamed on the fact that they took one or another drug. Most of the cases I just named were cases in which the claim is that the woman used methamphetamine and that caused her stillbirth. Now, it turns out that the research is quite clear that methamphetamine not only didn't cause the stillbirths in each of these cases, but it doesn't even have a mechanism by which it could cause stillbirths. I keep saying that if methamphetamine or any of the criminalized drugs were good at causing pregnancy loss, so many more women in all of the countries and states where abortion is criminalized would be using those drugs.
Makes a lot of sense. Exactly. I was thinking that. Yes. But it doesn't. And yet there's an assumption that this is what, by having that, that's why they've lost the baby.
Exactly. And while very few cases in the United States of any kind ever get to trial, and we try to keep them from getting to trial, because it's pretty clear that if you get in front of a jury and present a woman who had a stillbirth, it doesn't matter what the science says. It doesn't matter that the science says the methamphetamine could not have caused the stillbirth. Unfortunately, stillbirth is just a common outcome of pregnancy. Unrelated to drug use, 15 to 25% of women in the United States experience miscarriages and stillbirths. It is just a product of biology, not of actions that they've taken. But here's an unconscious bias and a cognitive phenomenon, which is, I think people, the human brain likes simple causality. They like to see one cause and effect and understand the world that way. And so if a case got in front of a jury, the experience from talking to lots of people, including on long flights from one part of the country to another, is that if it comes out of your vagina, it must be your fault. That the ability to think in any complexity about pregnancy doesn't really seem to exist. So if you have somebody who experiences a pregnancy loss, like Brittany Pula, a teenager who had a miscarriage, and there is a coincidental concurrent positive drug test, it is not hard work for a prosecutor to convict a jury that it must be her fault. It was in her body. It came out of her body. It must be her fault. But we really do know, not probably in some intuitive, conscious way, that we're learning more and more that what happens during pregnancy is really not nearly as influential as all of the health or lack of health care, all of the stress, all of the racism, all of the things that people experience before they ever become pregnant. And to get jurors and individuals to pull the lens back and say, wait a minute, maybe this pregnancy outcome has nothing to do with drug use and perhaps nothing to do with anything this person did while they were pregnant, is very, very challenging. And
That is. Yeah, and it's just so moving to hear this because we're talking about generations of people making assumptions and blaming the mother when actually, in real fact, that is not the case at all. How do we unpick that, Lynn? This is what I'm trying to get my head around. When you say challenging, I mean, that's putting it mildly. How do you get people to begin to think differently around this?
That is the question I absolutely pose to myself. I mean, we actually invested in doing polling and focus groups in South Carolina while the litigation against the Medical University of South Carolina, which we did ultimately win, was going on. And one of the conclusions that we had to ignore was we had sat down with community people in South Carolina and said, listen, what messenger would you listen to? Who would be persuasive to you to convince you that being pregnant and using crack actually does not cause any unique, specific harms, different from smoking, being poor, just living? And to a one, there was not a single source of information, including God, who these people would believe because they had seen on TV or they claimed they had held a crack baby or they knew otherwise. And so we were advised not to bother to try to challenge that belief. But clearly in the work that we do, we have to believe are educable, that we can counteract 50 years of drug war propaganda that's layered on top of 300 years of racism, that's layered on top of misogyny. It's a lot to try to unpack, but it's also very compelling because if you are able to get people to pull back the lens, there's so many opportunities for compassion, for addressing the problems people have. I mean, and just encouraging people to have a perspective that includes the circumstances people live in. And one of the things that I often do in talks, and this is a slide my daughter brought to my attention from when she was in college, Doctors and others, how do you have a healthy pregnancy? Well, you can focus on the individual and say things like, don't smoke. If you do, stop, don't drink, don't use illegal drugs, eat well, go to the doctor, manage your stress. These are all individual lifestyle approaches. But what if you focused on the fact that people live in a real community, in a social context, in a political context? If you really wanted to ensure healthy birth outcomes, you would have to say to people, don't be poor. If you can, stop and try not to be poor for too long. Don't have poor parents. Don't live in a
Mm.
poor neighborhood. Practice not losing your job and becoming unemployed. Don't be illiterate. Try not to be part of a racially or socially marginalized group. These are the factors that actually have much more to do with pregnancy outcome than anything the pregnant person does for the 9, 10 months of pregnancy. And the other thing, I'm not sure how much is unconscious and how much is conscious, is absolutely not including the person who contributed the sperm. We know that exposures men and fathers have had can affect pregnancy
Of
outcome.
course.
But there is so many layers of isms and prejudices that, you can take it all the way back. If somebody is pregnant and there's a bad outcome, or somebody's pregnant and they want an abortion, we often hear she should have just kept her legs together and not have had sex.
But here's a question, because it's proven medically that actually taking these drugs actually does not harm the baby. But when the women that you have met and know, do they know that when they were taking the drugs and they were pregnant? Were they aware that it actually was not harming their baby? Or were they taking them without realizing that it's okay?
It's complicated. I think it's different for different clients, different people. It was sort of remarkable at the beginning of the crack baby scare. A big magazine in the United States had a headline, babies born to crack addicted mothers are like no others. They're brain damaged in ways yet unknown. They're oblivious. Horrible things. And the assumption had to be it was part of the denigration of Black motherhood. But why would any responsible journalists believe there were a group of people, in this case Black mothers, who were taking a drug that they knew would damage their babies? If anybody had said there are rich white women and they're taking this drug and it's making all
Mm.
the babies stupid, you know that the reporters would have said, hey, wait a minute, we've got to really go check this out. That can't be true. But because it was layered on top of their history of slavery and racism, they were originally willing to believe it. There have been apologies, including from the United States newspaper of record, the New York Times, apologizing for a commentary called Slandering the Unborn. So, what I would think about when I was starting to meet some of the women who were being arrested is, what they looked around, they saw people using, I guess, a variety of substances, including cigarettes. My own mother smoked through her whole pregnancy and didn't see babies being born with particular harms. And so their experience would tell them that, some of them are not necessarily thinking that way. For some people whose drug use is a dependency problem over which they may have lost control, it's not an
That's
intent
different.
act.
Yeah.
So that can be happening. At the same time, I really don't know any person who's pregnant and given birth who doesn't blame themselves for something. If the baby is born with some complex genetic disorder that nobody had any control over, the literature says the mothers feel it's their fault and they feel guilty. When they place babies for adoption, they feel guilty.
Guilty, of course, yes.
If
I
you
mean,
want,
mothers, they say the minute you give birth, you get a middle name, and that's called guilt. Uh, it's just how it is, because you always want to do the right thing by that child.
I just want to say, my heart breaks that we've had clients who, at least until we've had the chance to get to know them and give them people to talk to, believe what the prosecutors say. They believe it was their fault. And it's heartbreaking because it wasn't. And a stillbirth, a miscarriage, a pregnancy loss is heartbreaking enough. But then to have somebody lie to you and arrest you because they claim it was something you did and you had control over is just that much more hideous.
It is completely and totally heartbreaking. I mean, every single story that you've been sharing, if you could see my face, I'm just, I was one point when I was trying to, literally put my head in my hands because I'm just so overwhelmed by the images that you were describing. But, you're working with this on a daily level, Lynn. So do you think that perhaps, I mean, we all are human, we still continue to have unconscious biases because that's what life is about.
Mhm.
Do you feel that you need to challenge your own unconscious biases? Are there things that still surprise you when something happens and you realize, whoops, I didn't realize I thought that?
It's always happening, and that the problem with it being unconscious is you don't know that
Well, exactly, exactly.
until it happens. I knew this question was coming. There are 2 things that are not quite so current, but 2 examples. One, when I first met the plaintiffs, the first 2 plaintiffs, Crystal Ferguson and Teresa Joseph, in the South Carolina case I mentioned, I don't think I held, sort of traditional biases or assumptions about people who use drugs. But based on what I was reading and the criminal charges, I think I assumed on some level that their drug use really was problematic and needed to be addressed. It just needed to be addressed through treatment and compassion and anything but the criminal law system. And it was in particular meeting those 2 women who, by the way they dressed when they met me, by the fact that I had brought some snacks and how they needed to eat them because they were hungry, I realized that whatever drug problem they actually had or didn't have, that it was the grueling poverty that they were living in, their inability to get better paying jobs in a state that doesn't allow unionization, in a state that has the longest history of enslavement of any state, that whatever might be problematic about their drug use, that was so clearly not the biggest problem in their life. It was poverty. And so that was an important lesson for me to learn. And another example on the other side, one can have a bias in favor of
Of
things.
course you can, yeah.
So I think I probably had an unconscious bias that women would be better bosses, better managers, provide better places to work. And so I've had the privilege most of my life to work for and almost exclusively with women. And I suspect I certainly have experienced not a whole lot of direct sexual harassment. But what I also had the privilege of learning from that is that I think one of the ways we get to be our best selves is having awareness of our own feelings, having insight into our own histories and our own feelings. And what I did come to learn is I don't think women are any better at that than men are. I don't think there's any guarantee of better leadership because somebody has ovaries. And I've just come to, appreciate anybody who has self-awareness and insight into their own emotions and who is capable of leading and sharing. And again, I have come to understand that there's just nothing about having ovaries that guarantees that.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, sort of 2 very, very important things. One is the heartbreaking stories that you have shared of the women that you're working with and working for in supporting them. And the fact there are so many layers of many hundreds of years that we have to unpick rather than just look at somebody up the face and acknowledge that this is how it is. And then, of course, something else, which is a lovely lighter note to end on, that it's far more about self reflection. It's far more about us as human beings rather than making assumptions that men are better for this and women are better for this. But it's to what degree do we self reflect? To what degree do we think about where we are and what we're doing that make us better at whatever we're doing, whether we're leaders or managers or anything else? That's great. Lynn, I've so enjoyed, I don't know if that's the right word, I've been so moved by your stories and I'm very grateful that you've shared them because I think more people around the world need to know the amazing work that you're doing and the huge misconceptions that so many of us have around the stories that you have shared in the dealings that you've had with the pregnant women in the United States. So, Lynn Paltrow, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias with me.
And thank you for having me. And I hope we'll get to see each other again on one side or the other of the ocean.
I'm sure we will. It's a small world. I look forward to that.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I have been told that this podcast is ranked in the top 3% globally and heard by people in 98 countries. Thank you, listener, wherever you are, whether it's Albania, Afghanistan, Nigeria or Nepal, Sweden or Saudi Arabia. We could not have this podcast without you, the listener. As always, if you like this episode, please do share. I would also like to thank Jack Godfrey for his original music for Season 6.